All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. All right, today I have the great pleasure of speaking to someone for whom I'm a great fan. His name is Stefan Betke, and he is most widely known as the artist named Pole. He's got an album coming out. Mute Records reached out to me, asked me if I wanted to do an interview with Stefan. I just about fell over because saying yes, I wanted to have a chat. And so that is what we get today. So with no further ado, let me say hello to Stefan. Hey man, how's it going?
Hello, I'm doing really good, sitting in Berlin and being excited to talk to you.
Well, and believe me, I am very excited to talk to you as well. So you have a new album coming out. Congratulations and thank you. The album is called Fading, and it is out as of November 6th. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the development of this album and kind of why you decided to put out an album now?
Why I decided to put an album out now is because I usually take between 5 and 7 years to make a new one. I'm a very, very slow worker. And the 5 years are over, or nearly 6 when it comes out, actually. That is the first thing. And how I came to this album is a kind of like in the first row, it is the same procedure as always. After making an album, like the last one, then I go playing live shows for a certain time, and then after a while I get headspace back and time back to go into the studio again and design something new. In this case, it took a little bit long, but I just started over doing something, and especially with this Fading album, it was a very specific situation because I moved studio. I had a new room existing, which I had to learn. And I was really excited to go into this new workspace. First of all times in my musical work with a view out of a proper window. And that was really, really lovely. And I enjoyed sitting cool. Just in there and say, like, okay, here I want to work.
Yeah, I have to admit that very seldom do I even think about the space that I'm working from, except for a while I lived up in the mountains of Colorado, and the place where I worked looked out onto a mountainside. And the quality of my work changed because my environment changed. And it was a very particular change in my own attitude, I guess, which just translated into the music. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, in the notes that I got from Mute, it kind of gave some background to your development of the album. And one of the things you talk about is sort of the name Fading representing sort of like a connection to memory and the memory of the print that people leave on the world, right?
Yeah. While I was trying to set up my new studio and doing new work in there, this is kind of like a side story. So it's not the main reason why I made this album, but it was influencing the beginning of this album. Mm-hmm. My mom got dementia, which is it's an interesting disease, actually, because you see somebody, or if you look at the lifespan of somebody, you get born with a kind of like a naive, empty brain or a box, you can say, and then you have to fill that up during your lifetime with knowledge, information, whatever gets into this hard drive in your head. And then if you get this disease, you start losing all this information again, and you kind of, it looks at from the outside perspective, it looks a little bit like everything is fading away, and only the very early memories of your lifespan stay in there. And that made me, it was not the reason why I made this album. Fading is not supposed to be a self-healing album to get over the death of my mom or whatever. Right. It was more like, I found it interesting you create something and you build something up, and in the worst case, you're going to lose it again during a full lifespan. And fading is this fading out of memory, fading away of things, and only the most important parts that you have in your head might stay. That was kind of like the inspiration for this album, without being, as I say, it's not the memorial for my mom.
Right, right. Understood. But it does seem to echo a number of different things. This story of your mother and dementia, that is one aspect of it. It also, though, seems to have a connection to the original trilogy of your pole work, the albums 1, 2, and 3, because those were just released in a 20th anniversary edition. And so there was that, and now a subsequent album. And in it, you mentioned this again in the notes, but as I listened to it, I was really taken by sort of your occasional use of like the vocabulary of 1, 2, and 3 as sort of a call out. And to me, it had kind of a visceral response in that it felt familiar and new at the same time. And that was it was interesting to me to see how you just very carefully wove that in a few places.
One of the ideas was with fading and the idea of a lifespan, keeping that as a kind of like an umbrella over the whole album. Drifting, for example, the first title on the album in the original was called Drifting / Lifespan.
Okay.
I wanted actually to reconnect to my own history in certain parts without repeating it. And that was the most complicated part for me. I wanted to connect to it and allow little bits and pieces to pop through fading that refers to the trilogy, but as well, as always, and you mentioned it before, developing my own vocabulary in my musical language.
Right.
So this kind of, usually I try to develop the vocabulary and try to go the next step and not really focusing on what I did before. It wasn't necessary to have a reference to these kind of recordings before. But here, in this case, I thought like it is worth reconnecting to it and in a very subtle way, bring it back in. If it worked, I would be happy.
Oh, well, I think it works phenomenally. And each listener will have their own connection to that. But from my perspective, it was it was great because it made it feel like it had a connection to those things. And again, especially since there was a recent re-release, it kind of had brought the 1, 2, 3 trilogy back into focus for me anyway. And so that was still relatively fresh in my experience, and having this come and just sort of like make slight echoes to it was really powerful and really effective. I thought that worked really, really fantastically. Now, you talk about a track like Drifting as kind of like describing your own history. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their personal history and their background and how they got to be the artists that they are. And I'm just wondering, what's your story? How did you get where you are today? I mean, one of the things we didn't even mention that I hopefully are going to talk about is that you're a very dedicated mastering engineer. You've been doing that for a long, long time. Your musical work is like heavily influenced by dub. It's got kind of these glitch tastes to it, but it's also very sound designerly, right? There's a lot of sound design that's woven into the creation of your compositions. And so there's sort of like this really interesting milieu of interests and capabilities that are you. And I'm wondering where that came from. What is it that got you there?
I tried to keep a long story short. I got musically socialized in the early 80s. I listened a lot to music like New York avant-garde jazz, John Zorn, Arthur Lindsay, Fred Frith, these kind of people. I listen a lot to experimental stuff, and I was playing in bands as a normal keyboard player for a long time, trying to make this kind of avant-garde jazz stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I developed, or I got into all this hip hop development end of the 80s, early 90s. That influenced my work a lot as well. And playing in bands for such a long time and being the keyboarder in bands and for a short time as well, an MC in my hip hop projects and all this, turned me into something like, okay, I found out about the 808, I found out about sample technology, I found out about mini moogs and synthesizer technology more than just playing a Fender Rhodes e-piano and an organ or something like this.
Right.
And I thought, like, okay, my role in synthesizer doesn't actually really complain about what I'm doing that much as my guitar player Christian did every day. He was more friendly to me, actually. And I studied music as well, and I was really into jazz and classic and all this kind of stuff. And one day, end of 80s, I think it was 89 or 90 or something, I was still in Düsseldorf with the background of Kraftwerk and Duff and all the people that were in Düsseldorf during that time.
Right.
I simply decided, okay, you can stay playing in a band. Yeah, it's easier to get girlfriends if you play in a band than if you're a solo artist. But at the same time, I started making music my own and composed stuff my own. And then it was a kind of like a hybrid. For a few years, it was I composed everything on my synthesizers, and we tried to play it with the band. And it took me a while to understand it is surely not necessary to compose on a computer or on a synthesizer or a sampler and reproduce it with the band. You can do it with the electronic equipment that you have available.
Right.
So it took me a few years to understand that. But then, beginning of the 90s, I suddenly had that in my head. And aside being really shy going on stage on my own with just the mini moog and an 808 and the sampler, the sample technology back in the days, it had about maybe 20, 30-second sample time or something.
Right.
You couldn't really do much about it, right? Other bands use tape machines on stage. But I try to actually really select, no, it must be possible that I do it just on my own, not simulating a band with a tape or whatever.
Right.
And that was, I think, looking back to these days, this was the time when I decided a track has to work with most minimal amount of elements in it. If it doesn't work then, and if I can't play it myself, then it is not well composed. You could maybe I don't know who it was. Maybe it was Bob Dylan or something. Somebody mentioned back in the days that if you can't play a good song on just the acoustic guitar, it's not a good song.
Right.
So this reduction became really important for me.
That is interesting. The one thing that doesn't connect for me is, so you have this background, and I can understand where once you start working with the technology, you have a lot of like fairly open doors. You can go down a hip hop path or like a techno-y path or something like that. But particularly your use of like dub flavors, right? The way that your bass lines work, the way that you have kind of the hypnotic rhythms and stuff like that. Where did you get keyed into that as a sound? Because a lot of your sound design and a lot of your, a lot of the either melodic or harmonic elements, they make sense coming from sort of an avant-garde background. But where did the dub influence come from?
The dub influence comes from, actually, I got aware of the dub influence much later. I got aware of this much later. In the beginning, I didn't listen to dub at all. I was really mostly into jazz and avant-garde jazz and hip-hop. Mm-hmm. But I was always absolutely into bass frequencies because in my understanding, the bass part is the fundamental architectural part in music at all. I mean, if you talk about house or techno or hip hop or whatever, you always have this structure: bass, then the middle range, snare and chords, and then the top range, cymbals, hi-hats, whatever you talk about. Boom.
Right.
So the structure is always exactly the same. But in different genres, you use these elements in different functionality. You are trying, if you would like, I mean, that comes out of the musical history in general. If composers wanted to simulate a singing bird, they would never use an upright bass to do that, because a singing bird doesn't have an upright bass, right?
Right,
So
right.
they were using a flute. So the functionality was pre-designed. Yeah, it was there. It was manifested like this. And my idea was, okay, what is the most important part if you are not interested in a normal pop song structure, like intro, verses, chorus, verse, chorus, outro, done, yeah, and melodies? What is then the most important part? The most important part is then a basement where you can stand on, then something that creates the atmosphere that you would like to represent in the track. And then you have to do something around it that holds it all together for 8 minutes.
Right.
So it is the same idea as in techno. It's just the idea that I didn't want it to become a techno artist.
Right. Right.
And then my history drops in again. Yeah. So I was more on the jazz side. And if you listen to the Blue album, there are a lot of jazz chords in it, or on the Yellow one, there are a lot of jazz chords, but they are so stripped down. The melody is never ever fulfilled. It's enough to just point into the direction. Then you can hear it.
Yeah, well, where I notice it especially is your use of the fourth interval, and how you do that jazz thing of like stacking fourths to make really complex chords out of like simple elements. And it's really effective, but it also is largely effective because you have that foundational bass that just so much locks a groove in that you can sort of throw these complexities in, and it's more of a spice than something that has to try and hold the whole track together.
But that is the dub element. I never tried to make reggae or original dub tracks. I used the method of dub.
Right.
And what is the method of dub? The method of dub is the idea to use something which is coming out of whatever genre, to reduce it to the key elements, and leave these key elements running as long as possible. And in dub music, the bass part and the rhythm is the most important element ever. If that rolls and if that is funky and groovy, it leaves enough space all over the whole thing to do whatever you want. And you can put a reggae chord on it, you can put a singer on it, but you can do as well a jazz chord on it. Why not?
Right.
And that is what happened after a while in my compositions. Even though I only understood that in around 96 or something, when I started working at Doublets and Mastering here in Berlin, when one of the guys there said, "Do you know that you're really dubby artist?" And I was like, "What do you mean, dubby artist?" And I said, they were like, "Yeah, you are close to all this Jamaican dub music." And I was like, I never really heard it. I'm aware of the Clash and all this, but Bob Marley and of course, all the successful artists I was knowing, but I never heard of Scientist or whatever, and I was not really into that. Yeah, and then from '96 on, I started learning about this and listening a lot, and then I understood, yeah, it's true. But what drove me there is, I think, simply the same idea: create a basement where you can put other things on top with not interfering, but they work together.
Right.
That was my hope.
Well, and then also this idea, and I think it's actually very rare in people doing electronic music to be doing things that have that song-like thing of being able to be pared down, right? You know, it's really significant if I listen to a lot of current either like dubstep type music or trap music or whatever. It seems like crammed full of stuff, right? It seems like it reminds me of, like, say, a birthday cake that has all frosting and all candles, but there's not actually very much cake in it. You know?
I hear you.
Yeah. And so I really appreciate that. Now, when you're actually developing a track, how do you start? Because when I listen to your music, like the melodic line that's made up of the bass seems so important, except also the rhythmic character seems so important, but also the sound designs of those special things and the timing seems important. And for me, it's hard to even imagine how you get started on a track.
To be honest, I have no idea how I do that.
Oh, really?
No, it's a little bit over judgment. It's always slightly different. Sometimes it can really be a rhythmical structure that I hear in my studio by accident. The accidents are a big factor in how I work. I have everything running. I do something. I reconnect a cable or whatever, and suddenly something happens, and I hear something in the background where, like, okay, this might be interesting to put a chord like this on top of it. Or sometimes I'm just playing around on my keyboards and have a chord first, put a delay on it and a reverb, and try to position it in the room a little bit, and then I hear something, and then I say, like, if I now do rhythmical part that focuses on this one, that might be helpful. But in general, it is in 99% of the cases in my production time the case that I do delete what I did in the first row. So while I'm working on stuff and adding stuff on the mixing board, it gets complex and more and more and more. And then at a certain point, I'm like, now the kick drum is, leave that out. Now the snare, we don't need this anymore. The delay on this chord is too much. It's enough if it's just a flanger or something like this. So it is a back and forth permanently. And maybe that's the reason why I need so much fucking time to actually really get ready.
Well, yeah, but actually makes a lot of sense, because really to sort of have that subtractive element to your music, you have to spend the time to generate a lot of stuff. You generate a lot of stuff just so you can decide what you don't need, right?
That's true. And I think I said that in earlier interviews as well. It's the most intense work for me is to find the elements which are necessary to keep a loop running. Doesn't matter if it's a 8-bar or 16 or 64-bar loop, and make the right decision to throw things away which are just filling up but don't have a real function in it.
Right.
That's the most complicated part for me. I rather go and say, like, okay, I like this chord or this melody or whatever I put on there, and I keep it in memory to start a new track with this, instead of just saying, like, oh, this gives another twist to the track, I leave it there, blah, 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 and then it gets fuller and fuller and fuller. I always believed in the idea, if it doesn't work with 8 tracks on the mixing board, it will never work. And I have a lot of tracks where I actually really go back and redo it, and change this and that, and you never get any better. It's just a different version, but it's not a better version.
Right.
Either it goes or it doesn't go.
One of the things that's sort of a well-known story is that a lot of your early sound came from you dropping a Waldorf four-pole filter, and it kind of hissing and crackling, and that became kind of a signature part of your sound. And I'm curious, again, kind of like delving into your background, but how you think. What is it, when that happens to me, when I get a piece of gear and it stops working right, all I can do is obsess about how this thing is broken. I have to take it out of the stream because it's messed up, right? How did you allow yourself to basically say, this is a weird sound and I'm going to embrace it? Was there something sonically that actually was really speaking to you? Or did it, I don't know, how did you just not immediately reject that?
Basically, this is the idea that I'd said before as well. Accidents are a very important element in my work, something which is not foreseeable. I always used all my equipment without reading the manual.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, turning it on, see what it does, and then only if you get really into trouble, then I started reading the manual how to save a song, a sound or whatever. Yeah,
Right,
but
right.
to make a sound was always intuitive. When I got this broken filter, it was connected to my mixing board, and I saw in the first row, thought like, yeah, okay, shit, it's not working. It does weird stuff. Blah blah blah. Leave it there, and then I forgot about it, and I was working on rhythmical parts with my 808 and other rhythm machines, and then by accident I unmuted the channel where this machine was connected to, and I heard it, and I thought like, fuck, this is much better than every rhythmical thing I programmed in my 808. It does it so perfect.
Right.
Yeah, it was just working with what I had on the other channels. And I think Brian Eno said something else in his diary, that it is so important to listen to what is not intended to see if there's a bigger image in it. That is what I heard when I unmuted this channel. I was like, this is much bigger than every 808 programming that I can do here. And from there on, I was like, okay, play with this machine and leave the rhythm machine out.
Right.
That was the beginning. It was simple as that.
That's interesting because it is a sound that kind of like permeates the history of your work. But again, not in necessarily a slavish way. I mean, in some cases, people who I sort of like self-identified as like glitch artists, the glitch became the work, right? In your case, I always felt like the music was really the heart of the work, and that was just part of the sonic flavor that made, that you had chosen for yourself. And I thought it was really great. Now, one thing, you do perform a fair amount, right?
Yeah.
Do you take new tracks and try them out in performance? Do you sort of like test drive your work, or is it always something that you kind of mold before you're willing to take it out and share it?
As I'm mainly producing albums which are following a conceptual idea, I barely test any tracks in clubs before or in concert situations, just to play it in between my older stuff or whatever, because very often they would not fit sonically to the other stuff which I did before, and musically even less than sonically, actually.
Uh-huh.
So what I do is I finish the conceptual work, and then I say like, okay, this is what I would like to perform, and then I prepare a live set, and then very often I go into a club here in Berlin or whatever and rent it for half a day and give it a try there, yes. But I always jump into the cold water and play it in front of the audience. And if it works, it works. If not, if not. Yeah. So I would never perform a track without knowing it is worth being performed.
Mm-hmm.
So the most negative part that can happen is that I play it wrong.
Right.
But it would be still the same track. So even me, I get better from time to time I play it.
Yeah. Well, that makes me wonder then, too. A lot of people that are in your position, when they're asked to perform, kind of do sort of like maybe an augmented DJing, right? They'll kind of like play along with their tracks. But given your background, given what you talked about doing your sort of like one-man obsessive electronic music work back in Dusseldorf, what does your live performance look like now? How do you perform in a way that is performative without just pressing play?
Well, it is kind of like still exactly the same as it always was. Back in the days, I had maybe 2 synthesizers with me, or 3 synthesizers and 2 effect units, and a 16-channel mixing board where everything was connected to, and I was playing with sequences, and every synthesizer played the sequence back that I wanted it to play,
Right.
and I did the overdubbing on the mixing board.
Right.
So basically, I created the space live on the mixing board while the sequences were playing the synthesizers. Now, the only difference nowadays is basically that we don't have to carry around heavy synthesizers anymore and sequences. We can have that in a computer.
Right.
But it's still the same thing. I have a bunch of effect units. I have a 16-channel mixing board, and I have two audio interfaces with 16 outs, and I run everything in the mixing board, and I do it in the dub way. Everything is playing same time, and I decide what comes through and what not, and if a delay comes on top of it or not. And then sometimes if it's the right location, I have a little keyboard with me where I can overdub and play chords on top of it. So the method is still exactly the same. It's just the footage comes now from the computer instead of the synthesizer.
Instead of from synthesizers, right. Well, it probably is also easier than to have to sort of like save and switch stuff. I mean, I come from a background where I was doing like live electronic music back in the days where like, you'd have to like take a floppy disk and switch floppies and stuff like that. That was a little ugly trying to pull off a gig that way. So I can imagine this is a lot more convenient. Now, I love hearing that you kind of work the mixing board kind of in that dub style. That's really cool. You said you came to dub music sort of late, and I hate to obsess about it, except I'm just like fascinated by people who take on a stylistic thing like that. Subsequent to that, how much you say that you kind of studied what the kind of the dub world and started listening to it more. Who were some of those artists? Who were some of the dub artists that you found most interesting or that you could learn from the most?
Oh, there are so many. So it's really tough to say. I mean, I think when I got aware of the fact that my music is dub influenced for some reason, with knowledge or without knowledge, or it was connected to dub. As far as I remember, the first biggest influences were people like Prince Farai or Scientists. I was really, really inspired by the very early work of Lee Perry with the 7 inches
Right.
that he released, all this weird skank stuff that he did. Later on, I turned a bit more into the dance hall direction as well, but that was not really that often so inspiring. It was too one-dimensional, functional. It was made for the dance floor.
It was made for a specific thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I was always interested in the space that certain people were able to create. Augustus Pablo, for example, what he did with just a super simple beat structure and just playing the melodica on top of it. That was mind-blowing. I mean, most people would not even be able to listen to these kind of records because they are so simple, but they are not minimal. So big difference. It's not minimal music, it is simple music, but very effective.
That's actually an interesting identifier you put there because I think a lot of people, when you talk about your process of like, taking things out until you get to the focused pieces that have to be there, most people then immediately jump to the idea that that's minimalist, right? That's a minimalist aesthetic. But I don't think of your work as being minimalist at all. And so it's interesting that there is that comparison with I loved some of the Augustus Pablo stuff. But that's a great touch point as something that is not minimalist, but is, maybe like highly focused or I don't know what the right word is, but I see what you're saying.
I think highly focused is the right word for it. But how can you get highly focused to a point? The only way to get to the possibility to focus on something is if you take everything out of the way that blocks the perspective. But minimalism is a totally different discussion. Yeah, minimalism just leaves out everything and just works with
this was one thing. Yeah,
with one thing. And even in minimalism, there are totally big differences. If you talk about Drunk Cage or whatever, it is a different minimalism than if you talk about minimal techno.
Mm-hmm.
We should learn again to be very precise with the genre names that we put on. Not everything I mean, nowadays everything is electronic music, right? Because I mean, you are recording through a microphone. This is an electronic interview.
Right,
Yeah?
right.
The microphone is electronic driven. I use electronic instruments, yes, but I'm way beyond being only electronic music, even though I use electronic equipment. Jimi Hendrix, was he an electronic artist only because he used electric guitar? You see what
I do,
what I mean?
yeah, right.
And then coming back to the point where you want to focus on, take everything out, the names, the description, everything, and just point to the focus and say, like, this is what I would like to express. And then we can say simplicity is the way to reach that point. In my case, how I work. Yeah. Every artist is totally different. God forsake.
Amazing and really thought-provoking. That's got my brains churning. So that's awesome. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. But before I let you go, first of all, again, the album is Fading. It's out on Mute Records, available as of November 6th. And then I don't know, my understanding is that the 20th anniversary edition of the vinyl of 1, 2, and 3 is long sold out, but I think you still can get digital versions of that easily enough. For people who want to follow your every 5 or 6 year release schedule, what is sort of like your home base for information?
Mute is a very connected label that I work with for long time, Mute Publishing as well. My own websites, my Bandcamp account, you can easily get information. But if people are interested and would like to follow me directly, it's best to go to the Pole artist site or the Scape label site or whatever.
Okay.
There are really tons of possibilities, but I'm already working on a follow-up 12-inch to the album with Mute, and I hope that I can get a little bit faster during the Corona times with work because I'm not traveling at all.
Yeah, right. Sure, of course.
Yeah, so I'm trying to catch up with new things and Mute, my Pole website or the Scape mastering website or whatever. It's pretty easy to find me. But if you type in Pole, don't be surprised to get about 50 links to pole dances. And then I pop up.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure that I don't have the kids in the room when I'm doing that. Awesome. Well, Stefan, I want to thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for that call.
Thank you so much.
All right. So with that, though, we will say goodbye to the listeners. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thanks a lot.
Okay, many thanks to Stefan for having the great talk. It was really amazing to get to hear some of his process and particularly how he thinks about creating and then weaning the system to build tracks that have the kind of fabulous sound that his work does. So make sure you get out there, listen to the new album, Fading. It's fantastic. If you are into it and you don't already own it, also get that 1, 2, 3 series. I think it's among the best work ever. So there you go. I want to thank all the patrons out there for supporting me. If you want to help support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/DarwinGross. In addition to postings about the podcast, I do various other blog entries too, so you might find something that's interesting there. Otherwise, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com, darwin.gross@gmail.com, or ddg@20objects.com. They'll all get to me. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you in 2 weeks. Bye.